Good morning to all those present in the hearing room here in Edinburgh and to those who are following us online. I've always said that this is an inquiry for all four nations of the United Kingdom, which is why I'm pleased to be here in Scotland to begin our public hearings in the devolved nations. Today we begin the public hearings for Module 2A, focusing on key decision-making in response to the pandemic in Scotland. May I emphasise yet again that I have not yet reached any conclusions, and I will only do so once I have heard and considered all the evidence, the oral evidence and the written evidence. We will start this hearing, as we have started the previous two modules, with an impact film. The impact films remind us all why the inquiry into the Covid-19 pandemic matters. Like its predecessors, it's extremely moving, and there will be those who find it too distressing to watch. I will pause in a moment to allow those who are in the hearing room who wish to do so to leave for a few minutes. The film lasts about 20-21 minutes, and those who are following online to press mute or pause the streaming. After the film has been played, we shall reassemble, and Mr. Jamie Dawson, King's Counsel to the inquiry, will begin his opening submissions. He will explain in some detail what we shall be examining in this module and what the issues are that need resolution. So with those who would like to leave or press pause, please do so now. Could we play the film?
March 2020, I had what I thought was a sore throat, and then it just stopped. I thought that was it. And then about a month later, woke up, couldn't breathe. GP said, "You need to go in a taxi right now to the hospital." Was there for about 10 hours, got home, assumed I would just get better. Well, I didn't actually get better, I was worse. Had the paramedics out to me a couple of times. Went to bed each night, not knowing if I was going to wake up the next morning, and just didn't get better. Went back to work, thought I had some improvement, did a phase return, failed it, got worse and worse and worse, and then over time started to become aware about long COVID.
I lost my mum and my husband within 6 months of each other, both from Covid-19. My mum, she was in a care home. She died in November 2020.
My husband Tom died in July 2022 of a pulmonary thromboembolism caused by Covid-19. He was 56.
I lost my mum on the 25th of April 2020.
He was an amazing role model, father, husband, friend, who died at the start of the pandemic.
When lockdown hit, I was trying to deal with my mum, who lived on her own. She was a shielding category. She was starting to suffer mental health issues due to being isolated. So we were extremely worried about both her mental health and her physical health. On 2 occasions, she got taken into hospital. On the second occasion, she wasn't happy. She said, "Take me home." The communication with her, an 80-year-old, was extremely difficult. She couldn't work the phone. We just relied on what the hospital told us. On the 2nd of January, they called to say they were doing a COVID test. They called that evening and said that she's positive.
I couldn't see my mum. We were at the mercy of the care home, and that was just window visits. She always looked after her family, always unconditional love. It's just hard because you feel you've not given that back to her because it's an enforced separation from her that you've never experienced. And it was over Skype when I first noticed that She was extremely ill. And at that time, I was actually raising end-of-life concerns, and no one else was sharing any health concerns with me. I was completely unprepared for what I was faced with, to be honest. I just looked at her and I thought she was dying.
I used to go and visit Mum daily, but I didn't go into her house. I wasn't inside my mum's house until she became unwell with a chest infection. Nobody was inside my mum's house. She couldn't have IV antibiotics at home, so she was admitted to hospital. She was only there for 4 nights and 3 days. And she came home, ambulance brought her home. Mum eventually was readmitted to hospital with COVID, and she was in hospital for 11 days, the first 7 of which none of us could see her. I got a phone call to say I could come and see Mum, but the doctor wanted to speak to me, and at that point the doctor, when we went in, the doctor broke bad news to me that Mum was not going to survive. She went to what I considered to be a place of safety, but I also knew it was a place of high risk. And it transpired that there were, in a care of frail elderly ward, there were 4 patients who had tested positive for COVID whilst my mum was in. I was with Mum when she died, holding her hand, telling her to try not to be frightened, telling her that my dad would be there, waiting for her, with his arms open wide, saying, "I've got you, Bonnie lass."
It was decided that Mum would go into nursing care. The nursing home that was identified, they were advised that Mum had been tested, but didn't tell them that the testing was done at the beginning of her admission. She was quite confused, offered food, but nothing really to worry about. They had taken a COVID test just to make sure. So I had phones and they said, "We'll see you at 2 o'clock, we'll get on Zoom and you'll see Mum." It wasn't even an hour later, I got a phone call. "Could you all please come?"
I kind of thought, surely to goodness, in the UK they won't sort of do things like, physical distancing. And then of course, when it came to it, they did. And I knew, I thought, right, if you've got any kind of disability, in my case, being blind, that is just going to be impossible, because that means that nobody can actually guide you.
My perception was that they thought we were carrying the virus because we had dirty wheels, for example, trying to convince the general public that we're not the problem is the biggest kind of impact that it had on me. It kind of just flips your whole lifestyle upside down.
My dad was on the waiting list for a hip replacement. Waiting lists at that time were 12 to 18 months, and then the pandemic hit. It was a further 3 years before he had the operation, in which time he completely lost the ability to walk. There was no provision for people with specialist needs for disabled people. The support and provision wasn't there. Nobody was thinking holistically about people in specific situations or circumstances or with conditions, and how that was going to affect their treatment or, the quality of their life thereafter.
Well, my mental health issues are pre-pandemic so severe that I struggle to leave the house. People with mental health issues have got a disability. It's not an illness. The difficulty in the actual dealing with the pandemic was, because I was mental health disabled, I didn't qualify for any help or support. Over the first 2 years, nobody actually took stock and went, "Who have we missed?" It was like, carry on regardless, it doesn't matter who's lost.
Being disabled, during COVID was, absolutely awful. I felt that we'd gone back about, goodness only knows how many steps, just with the way that everybody seems to think this was okay. That people weren't allowed to guide you. Of course, there was all these signs about where you could go and where you could stand and all this. That obviously we, as blind people, you can't read them. You just cannot have a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. And I was trying to sort of tell people that I didn't feel safe and it felt that people weren't listening to me. I just hope, you know, that, you know, if there is another pandemic, they treat disabled people so much, you know, better. It was like they forgot about disabled people, you know, and it was just so upsetting.
At the start of the pandemic, we were labelled one of the groups at risk. There was a wee bit too much emphasis on safety rather than long-term impact it would have on somebody. Preventing a pandemic is more important than actually being in a pandemic, because I've managed my own kind of support. I just feel that there should be more sort of understanding of what you can and can't do in that kind of situation, because I was trying to put as less pressure on the services, but putting more pressure on myself, because I didn't want to ask for it. I didn't know what I was entitled to and what was happening, because it was all changing on a daily basis. It's very difficult to keep up with that.
Throughout the pandemic, before the pandemic, after the pandemic, nobody's dealing with mental health. My local advocacy place hasn't reopened since the pandemic. I asked my GPs twice to get in contact with the health board for help for me, and went, no, you don't qualify, it's too strict. So nobody was fighting for us. It's 1 in 15 people have a mental health issue. Who's dealing with that number?
I can remember sitting prone over a kitchen table because I couldn't breathe. I would stay up for 36 to 30 hours because I couldn't sleep, couldn't lie down. I couldn't read, I could barely speak, I couldn't even watch the TV. I was just in this soup of misery. I assumed there would be help at the end of it, and there wasn't. And I've been on this journey to becoming disabled and having to come to terms with that. And my future is very unknown. I don't know what's going to happen. People think COVID's finished. It's not finished. It's not finished for anybody that's touched it. And you know, people, we're still here and we're still suffering. And the thing with long COVID is it's not just a strain on me, it's a strain on my wife. You know, and other people's families. People don't understand. It's not just the person that has long COVID that suffers. It's people around them.
I watched him for 2 weeks deteriorate in front of my eyes, go from a big strapping solid man to virtually nothing. And then after 2 solid weeks, he said he'd had enough. He phoned again and they said they'd need him in for testing. They had put him in a CPAP machine, normal oxygen first, unsuccessful, CPAP machine, unsuccessful. And that was the last I spoke to him. He was transferred to ICU. For 3 solid weeks he battled COVID. Never spoke to him, wasn't allowed to sit with him, and he died. He died on his own.
We both got COVID-19 in June 2022, and I lived and he died. It was all over in 15 minutes, and it was a blood clot in his lung. He leaves a mother, so that's really hard for her. He leaves a sister, it's really hard for her. He leaves 2 daughters, one of whom was newly pregnant when he died. He leaves a stepson, he leaves a granddaughter. So it's been very hard on everybody in that regard.
We made arrangements to go 2 at a time to visit her. They were basically saying that's the last time you're going to see her. So it seemed her dignity was gone and she was stuck in an isolated ward on her own. The hospital said, you need to come. So I went there. 1 o'clock in the morning I had been in there, and by 6 o'clock the following evening I was really at the breaking point. I can't do this. I can't watch her die.
They took me up the back stairs, the back entrance to the nursing home, and they said obviously I had to have PPE on. So it was horrendous because that was the first time I'd seen Mum in 3.5 weeks. And she went, "You've got 5 minutes." think that was just the protocol set, you know, for anyone. Do you know what I mean? I know there have been so many people and families who never even got that chance, who literally never got to say goodbye. So I was brought back down the stairs, and the charge nurse came at the back of me and said Mum had gone. So my dad didn't even get to see my mum. And it's been tough, real tough.
She wasn't breathing properly. She wasn't able to look at me. She wasn't able to speak. And then when they announced when I was there that I only had 10 minutes to stay with her, the distress, torment really, you feel over that one visit, that 10-minute visit. Obviously she died, and it was only later on when I found out that she'd just died, she'd been on her own. And that tortures me really, the fact that I wasn't there to hold her hand. I wasn't there to give her reassurance. I wasn't there to show my love. That was kind of denied, and it was so important.
My husband and I then, we both were unwell with COVID. One day I would think my husband was going to die. The next day he would think I was going to die. He became really very unwell, couldn't catch his breath, and he ended up going into hospital. But very quickly it became apparent that things were not going well. The conversation around DNA CPR with my husband initially was measured, but I became aware that the questions were changing. The decision about that was not communicated to me until the morning my husband died. The nurse made me aware that my husband was not for DNA CPR and would not be going to ITU, would not be getting ventilated. My husband was aware, but they had reduced his oxygen to not even therapeutic level. It was not even comfort level. And there was no care or compassion in that room when I went in. And he died about 30 or 40 minutes after we got into that room.
He was very good-humoured. He had so much initiative. So not only have I lost my partner, but as you walk in through the door, you don't have that gaiety, the fun factor, his initiative. I just need to change everything, not to be reminded of who's missing and what's missing from my life.
There's been no normal grief. We don't know how to be a family of 5 because we're a family of 4. I have no one to talk to. I'm on my own. I can't go to work with no financial support, with no emotional support. The loneliness of not having that person there, the physical person to bounce your life with, the hopes, the dreams ripped away for you. Nothing worthwhile living for. You blame yourself for everything. You've got guilt, you've got fear, anxiety, and you just relive the last final days over and over and over again.
I don't accept the way she died. I don't. I think it was avoidable. We tried to protect her and she went into a healthcare setting and she caught COVID in a healthcare setting. And they couldn't explain to us where she caught it or how she caught it. You put a vulnerable 80-year-old in a ward with other people and you didn't test them. They only tested them when they were symptomatic. At that point, it's too late. It just needs to be better managed so that other people don't go through the same pain that we do.
Part of that grief process is about sending, your loved one, it's like it was literally our last journey. And it just felt that we had abandoned her, really. I tried to protect my mum and dad from everything, but I couldn't protect my mum from COVID. And I couldn't give her what she needed when she actually really did need the most. That 5 minutes with my mum lasted a lifetime.
I've got the guilt of not being there when my mum needed me, when I know she would never have ever let me down. It's just the shock and trauma and just trying to move on and live because you know your mum would want you to move on with your life, but it's extremely difficult. And I don't think it's possible for me. After 3 years, there's still the pain.
And people think you get over it. You don't get over it. It's something I think that you endure and you manage and you try to control. And you put one foot in front of the other every day. But it's hard work. I don't think it was consistent. My experiences were inside the same health board, but in 2 different locations in that health board. And they were very, very different. So we need to pay attention to that going forward, that we need to consider more the well-being of our people in every aspect of well-being, and that care and compassion must be at the forefront of that.
How are you supposed to be better after 3 years and 37 years together? How are you supposed to be better? If somebody could tell me that, I'd be happy to follow that guideline or that example, because I just don't know how the impact COVID is something I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy.
There needs to be lessons learned, hugely, particularly how loved ones were in a nursing home. I only seen brief time of that, even just literally 4 days in a nursing home, and not being able to see your loved ones, and that isolation alone, that should never ever happen again.
Every citizen in our country was impacted upon by COVID. If we don't learn lessons, we'll sleepwalk into making the same decisions again. And many, many thousands and millions of people in this country will be in the same position that I'm in now, that everyone who lost someone is in now, that everyone who has long COVID is in now.
I want accountability, and I don't understand why we're in the position where we are, where people with long COVID are having to fight for treatment, and not much has changed. The impact it's had on our society is colossal. We don't want to just learn lessons from the past, we want these lessons to be implemented now while people are here. It's unbelievable. I say it's destroying people's lives, it really is. It's destroying people's careers, their ability to work, their ability to earn or do anything. This problem's not going to go away. People are still developing long COVID, the numbers are not going down, they continue to rise. More and more people are getting it, and we don't really seem to be any further forward. It's dreadful.
Mr. Dawson.
My Lady, I am Jamie Dawson, KC, Lead Counsel to the Inquiry in Module 2A. I appear along with my learned juniors, Mr Usman Tariq and Mr Andrew McGuirter, advocates, along with Mrs Heather Arledge, Miss Bethany Condren and Miss Stephanie Painter of the English Bar. May I say on behalf of those who are based north of the border to you and our colleagues who have travelled to Edinburgh for these substantive hearings of Module 2A, welcome to Scotland. In these hearings, which as I say are taking place in Edinburgh, we will examine the political response to the pandemic in Scotland in the period between January 2020 and April 2022, when the last restrictions were lifted in Scotland. We will do so with the benefit of being able to assess, at this relatively short but significant distance from the events of that period, the decisions which were taken by government in Scotland, predominantly those of the Scottish Government, in the discharge of its most fundamental responsibility, to protect the people of Scotland from harm and ultimately from death. As you have just heard, my lady, and as one gentleman said, people think COVID is finished. It's not finished for anybody that's touched it. Another lady said that every citizen in this country was impacted by COVID. The systems by which decisions were taken within the Scottish Government, including the extent to which these systems enabled advice to inform and improve decision-making are a key part of this module. Given what we have just watched in our opening video and the themes which emerge, the tragedy, the heartache, the loss and destruction of life, the inquiry must do what it can to see that in future, all that can be done will be done to avoid this happening again. We will examine in due course with statistical witnesses tomorrow the detail of the various aspects of the pandemic in Scotland, including the peaks of infection and death, the hospitalisation rates, and the effects of the pandemic on various different elements of Scottish society, which will be demonstrated in charts and graphs. The headline figures lay bare the devastation caused by the virus and the ebb and flow of infection in Scotland. Data relating to reported infections shows that the peak of the first wave was the 27th of April 2020, with 434 newly confirmed cases. However, underreporting of cases was particularly severe in the first wave, due in particular to limits on testing and tracing capacity. The Alpha variant first emerged in Kent around September 2020, and by the time of the peak of the second wave of infections, the 29th of December 2020, there were 3,137 confirmed cases. This variant was at that time responsible for the vast majority of infections nationally. The next wave, primarily of the Delta variant, peaked on the 2nd of September 2021, with 7,622 confirmed cases. This was followed by the huge Omicron wave, which peaked in Scotland on the 29th of December 2021, with 23,539 confirmed cases. The ONS infection survey shows that at the peak of the second wave, around 1% of the Scottish population was infected, and at the peak of early 2020 Omicron wave, it was around 8%. These statistics, my lady, are mere context. As you have heard in the video which we have seen, this devastation affected real people, real lives. It has caused long-term harm. As far as deaths in Scotland, where Covid-19 was mentioned as one of the causes of death on the death certificate, are concerned, the peak of the first wave was on the 9th of April 2020, with 108 deaths occurring that day. The peak of the second wave was the 16th of January 2021, with 77 deaths. Smaller waves occurred from late 2021 onwards, the highest peaking on the 20th of March 2022, with 34 deaths. The total number of COVID deaths reported in Scotland from the beginning of the pandemic up to the 31st of March 2022 was 14,130. Compared to the UK as a whole, Scotland had lower levels of excess mortality in the first and second waves in the pandemic. However, in contrast, throughout mid to late 2021, Scotland had higher levels of excess mortality. You will hear, my lady, that even where infection did not result in death, infections cause significant physical and mental consequences. The direct impact of severe disease and death due to COVID did not fall equally. Older people were at particular risk. Up to the end of 2022 in Scotland, more than 70% of those who died from COVID were 75 and over. Of course, age was not the only factor that led to stark inequalities and deaths from COVID, although no other individual factor has a stronger effect. Mortality was 2.5 times higher in the most deprived than the least deprived in the most deprived areas in the least deprived areas of Scotland. People from some ethnic minority groups had a significantly higher risk of being affected by COVID-19 and dying from it. Risk of COVID-19 mortality in Scotland during the pandemic has been the highest in people from Pakistani communities. Mortality rates were higher among people with disabilities, including, in particular, those with a learning disability. The consequences for the people of Scotland resulting from the countermeasures taken by government to combat the virus were also considerable. Though I will return to evidence available to the inquiry in relation to these harms specific to Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, these included the effects of social isolation, including significant impacts on mental health, a rise in domestic violence, in particular against women and children, serious impacts on education and the development of children and young people, and the serious exacerbation of pre-existing social inequalities. Those suffering from pre-existing health conditions were not only more vulnerable to infection and but also serious morbidity or death. However, their non-COVID health conditions went undiagnosed, unmonitored and untreated due to the pressures created on the health service by the extent of infection which occurred. Almost every area of public life, including schools, the transport system, the justice system, prisons, the majority of public services were all adversely affected. Hospitality, retail, travel and tourism, arts and culture, and the sport and leisure sectors effectively ceased to operate. Even places of worship closed. In economic terms, the pandemic resulted in the deepest and fastest economic contraction on record, with the Scottish economy contracting by 19.4% between April and June 2020 alone, the biggest fall in quarterly gross domestic product on record. The economic downturn was widespread, but particularly affected customer-facing sectors. Accommodation and food services saw the biggest decline during the second quarter of 2020, with gross domestic product dropping by more than 80%. The number of Scotland's businesses fell by over 5% in the first year of the pandemic, between March 2020 and March 2021, meaning that Scotland lost almost 20,000 small businesses. Whilst the number of deaths rose, the NHS, the police and emergency services and other key workers in Scotland continued in their place of work. Many frontline workers lost their lives because of COVID-19. Almost everyone else was forced to work or be educated from home, was furloughed or lost their jobs. At the peak, around 780,000 jobs in Scotland were furloughed under the UK government's coronavirus job retention scheme, equating to 32% of the workforce. The details of this impact on every corner of Scottish life will be examined in greater detail in later modules, but these headlines are an important backdrop to the key decisions which were made to fight the virus, to manage the devastation and lessen the loss by those in government, which we shall examine here. In this module, we intend to build on the evidence which has been heard by the inquiry in modules 1 and 2, which related to the preparedness of the UK, including Scotland, for an emergency of the nature of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the high-level response of the UK government to it in the period from January 2020. At this point, the focus turns to Scotland and the key decisions taken by those with the responsibility for managing the pandemic response in this nation. The main thrust of the module relates to the decisions taken by the government in Scotland, in particular the questions of the reasonableness of what the public health experts would call non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, introduced by them to seek to combat the virus. These NPIs were the measures taken by way of restrictions on our normal lives to seek to protect us from the onslaught of viral infection, and range from the use of face masks and coverings and social distancing to lockdowns. They were taken throughout the temporal scope of the module, from January 2020 to April 2022, by government decision makers. They varied in their nature and extent, as well as their perceived objective. They were taken in different contexts, and at times in the face of uncertainty or rapidly changing facts or advice. They varied in their effectiveness. In many instances, the requirement to strike a balance between competing potential harms which underpinned them resulted in aspects of our lives receiving benefit, while detriments were caused elsewhere. Benefits and harms fell unevenly across Scotland. However, what we seek to do in this module is to understand the decisions which were taken, why they were taken, in order ultimately to assess whether they were reasonable, evidence-based, and in the best interests of the people of Scotland. Where they appear not to have been, we seek to explore what might have been done better to achieve these aims. We do so as we have been charged under our terms of reference and the scope of our module, in order that the people of Scotland can ultimately gain an understanding of why the pandemic was managed in Scotland as it was, but also to try to form the basis of possible recommendations to government as to how any such future disaster might be handled better. Those who suffered infection, hardship and bereavement in the pandemic in Scotland deserve no less. I am delivering this opening statement on behalf of the inquiry team to provide you and the public who are listening with a summary of the relevant evidence which has been gathered by the inquiry to date and outline evidence you will hear over the next few weeks. In doing so, I intend to deal with the following broad matters. Firstly, my lady, I intend to look at some of the practical steps taken by the inquiry since I last presented to you at the preliminary hearing in October. I will summarise then evidence which the inquiry has already heard or has available to it so far. This is not intended as mere repetition, but as an important summary in this module for context but also substance. One important advantage of this UK-wide inquiry is its ability to compel evidence from across the UK to enable comparison and context. What has gone before is thus of relevance to your assessment of the evidence you will hear in Scotland. Further, some core participants and members of our wider public audience in Scotland will be tuning into this module and may not have had the benefit of hearing the evidence in previous modules which you have heard. The UK context, which you have heard in Module 2, is important here, given Scotland's devolution settlement, which means that UK ministers and decision makers are decision makers in Scotland too, directly in certain areas and indirectly in others. I will then move on, my lady, to set out a chronology of key events. Its intention is to provide factual context to the issues with which we will be concerned in the module. It intends to set out the key NPIs imposed on Scotland, their apparent significance, and the way that the pandemic progressed in its devastation across the country. I will then highlight some other areas that we will cover at the hearing and set out in some more detail our plans, insofar as we can reveal them at this point, for how we will go about our business before concluding. In accordance with their right to do so, you will later today hear opening statements delivered on behalf of eight core participants in this module as follows. Ms Claire Mitchell, KC, will speak on behalf of Scottish COVID Bereaved. Mr Danny Friedman, KC, will speak on behalf of Disability Rights UK and Inclusion Scotland. Sam Jacobs will speak on behalf of the Trades Union Congress and the Scottish Trades Union Congress. Rory Phillips, KC, will speak on behalf of the National Police Chief Council. Simon Bowie, KC, will speak on behalf of Public Health Scotland. Una Doherty, KC, will speak on behalf of NHS National Services Scotland, and Geoffrey Mitchell, KC, will speak on behalf of the Scottish Ministers. The other core participant in this module, Scottish Care, has opted not to deliver an opening statement, although you will hear from a representative of that organisation evidence later this week, my lady. So to turn then to a number of practical matters of significance as to where we have reached in the module. You will recall, my lady, that a third preliminary hearing in the module took place in October of last year, and I intend to provide a broad update as to where we have reached. At the last hearing, I provided an update of documentary recovery received by the module. Both discovery and disclosure of documents to core participants has continued to occur since that date. The up-to-date position is that 54,331 documents have been recovered by the module in response to its Rule 9 requests. A little over 36,500 documents have been disclosed to core participants after an assessment of relevance. I set out at the last preliminary hearing a history of the documentary discovery in accordance with our numerous requests to Scottish Government and its various directorates. We remain grateful for the documents which have been produced in helping to resolve the issues in the module from Scottish Government, and they have continued to be so since I last addressed you. We intend to address various issues in the module, more detail of which I will narrate in this opening statement. When seeking documents on various occasions from the Scottish Government, we have sought to be clear as to what we need to see, focusing our detailed requests on both the scope of the module and the list of issues with which they are provided. This effort, my lady, as I set out at the last preliminary hearing, has involved a number of requests and at times some difficulties getting hold of the documents which we wished to have. In order to assist the process, we set out for the Scottish Government a number of key documents which in our view were essential to our assessment of matters within the module. These included cabinet minutes and associated papers, situation reports, provided to a Scottish Government decision-making body the minutes and associated papers of the Scottish Government's COVID advisory group, and a residual category of documents containing documents provided to ministers, setting out advice, commentary, recommendations and submissions concerning key decisions. It is our understanding, my lady, that the Scottish Government has provided to us all of the documents that it considers falls within these important categories. We therefore approach these hearings on the basis that we have everything that we need, which we have been able to analyse. If that transpires not to be the case, as I said in the preliminary hearing in October, we will want to know why. My lady, you'll remember, and perhaps have seen some significant press attention since the last preliminary hearing, the issue of the recovery of informal communications. You will recall that this was included amongst the list of issues in the module, in particular issues relating to structures which were in place to enable effective communication amongst key decision makers, how effectively they function, and how they developed. These included informal systems of messaging, such as texts and WhatsApps, in any aspect of core decision making. We made it clear to the Scottish Government that we expected documents either held by them or in the hands of individuals with whom they were, on whose behalf they were acting, that we would expect to see these documents as part of our assessment. You'll recall, my lady, at the last preliminary hearing that we had some difficulty with accessing these documents and that few, if any, had been made available to us. I'm pleased to say, my lady, that after a certain degree of political controversy over the issue, a large number of documents have now been made available to us. These have been analysed and relevant messages will be put to witnesses during the course of these hearings. These comprise messages from around 85 messaging groups, which came directly from the Scottish Government, and a total across both types of messages, i.e. those within groups and between individuals, of around 28,000 messages. These include messages from prominent ministerial decision makers and others in key advisory roles within the Scottish Government. One further practical matter, my lady, which I'd like to touch upon, which I touched upon at the last hearing, is that of legal professional privilege. You'll recall, my lady, that I raised the issue at the last preliminary hearing, and I have an update to set out in that regard. At that hearing, I explained that after prior discussions, on the 3rd of August 2023, our module formally requested that the Scottish Government waive privilege in the documents being provided to the inquiry. That was to enable the inquiry to be sure that it was able to probe all corners of the relevant documentation to deal with the varied and important issues which are raised in the module. Various proposals were made by the Scottish Government in the period around and after that hearing, and there was a significant amount of engagement about it. My lady, the position which we have reached now is that the Scottish Government has effectively waived LPP in the documents which have been provided to us, other than in respect of something called the Law Officers' Convention, and even in that regard only in relation to law officers' opinions. Our current assessment of the documentation is that slight reservation on the waiver will result in very few documents having redactions applied to them. One thing I would say, my lady, which is of relevance to co-participants in particular, that though this is a welcome development, the lateness of this decision on the part of the Scottish Government has had a practical effect. The number of documents which had redactions applied for either of these reasons amounted to around 3,282 documents. These have now been provided to the inquiry in accordance with the Scottish Government's waiver, with the redactions removed. Many of these had already been disclosed to core participants and reviewed by the inquiry. The unredacted documents require to be reprocessed, disclosed and reviewed. This takes time. A certain amount of priority documents for the purposes of these hearings have gone through that process already. These comprise cabinet minutes and associated papers, totalling just under 400 documents. But there is an ongoing process for the other documents to be disclosed. As a result, there will be a practical impediment to the amount of documentation that we will have seen, although, as I've set out, the developments in this regard are welcome on the part of the inquiry. My lady, since the last preliminary hearing, when I set out a number of steps that we intended to take in advance of this hearing, I'm pleased to be able to say that we have managed to complete, I think, all of them. We have sent out to core participants for their assistance 2 key documents, one which sets out a chronology of key events, key decisions, and details of the ebb and flow of the pandemic in Scotland, which is in far more detail than I intend to cover today, I'm sure you're pleased to hear. We have also sent out another document which intends to encapsulate what we consider to be uncontroversial evidence relating to a number of key individuals and the roles they played in the Scottish pandemic response, and also the way in which key bodies within Scottish Government and its advisory systems were structured. We trust that these documents are of assistance, and we will give consideration in due course to the possibility of publishing either both or one of them. My lady, at that juncture, if I may turn to the next section of my opening statement, which relates to the evidence available to the inquiry already, which is related to the ambit of Module 2A. We anticipate, I hope reasonably and certainly consistently with the way in which we have approached preliminary hearings in this module, that the audience will be likely to comprise those who are interested predominantly in the Scottish experience of the pandemic, and thus that many may have little or no experience of the evidence which the inquiry has already heard, which constitutes important context. The context is, in our view, important both for understanding what this module is, but also what it is not. The module is not an analysis of Scotland's preparedness for an emergency such as the pandemic. That was looked at in Module 1, a summary of key evidence in which I will set out in a moment. Given the role that both the UK Government and the Scottish Government had in planning for an emergency in Scotland such as the pandemic, Module 1 covered both aspects of that. Equally, the module is not a detailed analysis of UK government decision-making. Much of that ground has been covered in Module 2, with detailed oral testimony having been taken from ministers, senior civil servants and other advisors relating to the management of the pandemic at UK level, many of those decisions taken at that level, of course, having either a direct or indirect effect in Scotland as well. The module seeks to focus instead on the decision-making of the Scottish Government, which was the predominant means by which the pandemic was managed in Scotland. It would be artificial, however, for the evidence of the Scottish ministers and their advisers to be heard in complete isolation. The reality of a combination of the devolution settlement, which allocated responsibility for reserved matters to the Westminster Parliament and hence the UK Government, and devolved matters to the Scottish Parliament and hence the Scottish Government, coupled with the all-encompassing nature of the pandemic, which affected in some way all aspects of society, resulted in both governments having control over the management of the pandemic in Scotland to some extent. Though our focus will be on the evidence of the Scottish ministers and their advisers, an examination of the management of the pandemic in Scotland will entail an examination of the Scottish Government perspective on key decisions and structures and working between the two governments. To an extent, this has been examined with UK Government ministers and advisers in Module 2, but we also will need to look at specific aspects of intergovernmental working, which we will do with both Scottish Government and UK Government ministers. This will not be a rerun of the evidence heard by you already, my lady, in Module 2, but it will draw upon that evidence and seek to look at key aspects of the role of the Scottish Government and the UK Government in their interrelation, insofar as significant in the way that the pandemic was managed in Scotland. Equally, the module is not a detailed examination of the impact of the pandemic or the way in which it manifested itself in certain key sectors of society in Scotland. An analysis of impact will come later. A more detailed investigation into the way that the pandemic manifested itself in sectors such as the NHS and care in Scotland, the rollout of testing and vaccination programmes, the procurement of PPE will come later. However, the general epidemiological flow of the pandemic, the spread of infection, death and morbidity caused by it in its wake, and the key high-level political decisions which were taken to try to combat the virus do form part of our investigation. Thus, the understanding of and the key decisions taken or not taken by government in Scotland in the field of care concerning vaccination strategy, regarding testing for the virus and other protections from it, like PPE, will be considered to the extent necessary to get to the bottom of the government strategy, its reasonableness, its proportionality, and its efficacy. As I have made clear at previous hearings relating to the module, the reason for approaching matters in this way is to try to get to an understanding of the key issues which affected the largest number of people in Scotland, and to provide an assessment of those issues in a report at a time when those issues are still live in the memory. To turn then, my lady, to the evidence heard in previous modules about Scotland's preparedness for a pandemic, which was largely looked at in Module 1. The evidence you heard, my lady, was to the effect that prior to the arrival of Covid-19, the Scottish Government operated a hub-and-spoke resilience model, with the Deputy First Minister, then John Swinney, at the head of its resilience division. In the event of an emergency of any kind arising, the Scottish Government Resilience Room, or SCORE, could be activated to coordinate and direct actions designed to respond to the incident. In his evidence, John Swinney confirmed that the last recorded meeting of SCORE before the pandemic had taken place on the 14th of April 2010. As far as operational response was concerned, agencies relevant to the response, such as police, fire service or health boards in any given emergency, would form something called a resilience partnership, within which structure they could coordinate, collaborate and share information. There were 3 regional resilience partnerships, within which local resilience partnerships composing multiple local agencies sat. Alongside that was the Scottish Resilience Partnership, a core group of the most senior statutory responders and key resilience partners. The group acted as a strategic policy forum for resilience issues, providing advice to ministers. Work to prepare for the pandemic or such other emergency was done on a UK 4 nations basis. Preparation focused on planning for a flu pandemic on the basis of expert scientific advice. Infectious disease was, however, also identified and considered in the Scottish Risk Assessment, which you looked at in Module 1. It was considered that the reasonable worst-case scenarios for flu would apply to other risks if they occurred, and preparations could be adapted. This was on the basis that in planning for an emergency, focus was not on the consequences, i.e. the impact of a pandemic, and not on the cause. There was an antiviral stockpile. FFP3 respirator masks were part of the PPE stockpile in preparation for the pandemic. In addition to having adequate supplies of PPE, the 4 nations did also have a just-in-time contract for FFP3 respirators as a contingency, though the foreign supplier was actually prevented from fulfilling the contract by their government at the early stages of the Covid-19 response. PPE for Scotland and the other devolved administrations was procured through the Public Health England. This was on the basis of economies of scale. The Barnett formula, about which we'll hear more in this module, was used, and so Scotland took about 8.2% of the total required for the UK. It was then sent to Scotland and safely stored in a warehouse. It was procured by the Scottish Government for the NHS and social care staff. Agencies, such as, for example, the police, would have been aware that they required to have their own stockpiles of PPE for use in an emergency. Scottish planning for a pandemic was largely based on the UK model, which, as you have heard, was based on a possible influenza pandemic. Scotland conducted its own pandemic influenza preparedness exercises, including Exercise Silver Swan in 2015 and Exercise Iris in 2018, relating to a possible outbreak of MERS. Scotland had a role in the National Exercise Cygnus in October 2016, which also concerned preparedness for an influenza pandemic. Workshops set up in January 2018 on local authorities' flu pandemic preparations occurred in Scotland. A report was produced from that exercise, which Scotland was not involved in producing, but access to it was given by their colleagues in England. The report contained a number of recommendations for people to consider. A number of tabletop exercises were spoken about in the evidence which you heard. In her evidence to Module 1, the former Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, Catherine Calderwood, reviewed the utility of these tabletop exercises. She noted that some of the recommendations from previous exercises were still outstanding by January 2020, and that, of course, had the timing, nature and extent of this pandemic been fully understood, the full implementation of all of the recommendations, and in particular those following Exercise Iris, would have been expedited, but this was not the case. My lady, Module 1 testimony also suggested, perhaps relevant to evidence that you will hear here, that the relationships between the UK government and the Scottish government, in particular at ministerial level, were unusually poor in the lead up to the Covid-19 pandemic. This was also stressed in an expert report which you heard about from Professor Ailsa Henderson in Module 2. In his evidence in Module 1, John Swinney stated that generally relationships between the administrations were pretty poor by that point. Poor in the aftermath of Brexit, because obviously constituent parts of the United Kingdom, well, we were in Scotland, we were not happy with Brexit at all. Not happy with and you obviously had to spend a lot of time on the no-deal Brexit, as the inquiry heard this morning from Nicola Sturgeon. But generally, relations were pretty poor. The UK influenza preparedness strategy of 2011 considered interventions such as those which might be used in a pandemic such as the one caused by Covid, but it did not consider lockdowns. Instead, it encouraged carrying on with normal lives for as long and as far as that is possible, whilst taking basic precautions to protect themselves and lessen the risk of spreading influenza to others. My lady, that's a broad summary of where we reached with various aspects of the evidence in Module 1. I would also like to touch to an extent on some of the evidence which you've heard, which emanated from the Module 1 section, relating to the position, in particular for those vulnerable and at risk before and during the COVID pandemic. In Module 1, which also looked at Scotland, your ladyship heard evidence relating to the underlying fragility of the NHS in Scotland before the pandemic. For example, in a statement taken from the Royal Medical College's Professor Stephen Turner, he stated that before the pandemic was declared in March 2020, capacity to provide healthcare in Scotland and the UK was already limited. Waiting lists for clinic appointments and operations and waiting time to be seen in the emergency department were all rising. You heard evidence, my lady, from Professor Claire Bambra and Sir Michael Marmot on health inequalities, which provided an important backdrop to the evidence which you will hear about the reaction to the emergency health crisis in Scotland from January 2020. Their evidence was to the effect that there is a clear socio-spatial gradient in health in the UK. The more deprived local authorities have worse health outcomes than in others. Scotland featured at the lowest end, with data from the Office of National Statistics from 2020, showing that for 2017 to 19, both male and female life expectancy was lowest in the UK in Glasgow City at 73.6 and 78.5 years, 11.3 years less than the most affluent part of the UK. Even in Glasgow, they opined that there are very large inequalities in life expectancy between the least and most deprived areas, 11.6 years for women and 15.4 years for men. In Scotland, healthy life expectancy at birth amongst men living in the 10% most deprived areas was 47 years in 2017 to 2019, compared to 72.1 years amongst those living in the 10% least deprived areas. Women in the most deprived areas could expect to live to 50.1 years in good health, compared with 71.6 years in the least deprived areas. You also heard, my lady, plans which the Scottish Government had put in place to deal with this desperate health situation. It was established that a paper entitled Public Health Priorities for Scotland from 2018 set out national and local government priorities for health over the next decade. These were underpinned by a focus on reducing health inequalities and had tackling health inequalities as its primary objective. A new national body, Public Health Scotland, was established as a result in 2020 as a national special health board within NHS Scotland. It has responsibility for providing evidence, analysis and intelligence to support public health and health inequalities, policy development nationally and to support local activity. It was concluded, however, by Messrs Bambra and Marmot that, with some exceptions, the specialist structures concerned with risk management and civil emergency planning did not properly consider societal, economic and health impacts in light of pre-existing inequalities. The UK government and the devolved administrations and relevant public health bodies did not systematically or comprehensively assess pre-existing social and economic inequalities and the vulnerabilities of different groups during a pandemic in their planning or risk assessment processes. There was also, my lady, heard in previous sections of the inquiry, in particular in Module 2, a good deal of evidence which related to structural discrimination. You'll recall, my lady, that at an earlier stage in the inquiry's processes in response to submissions made by a number of core participant groups, you acceded to a request for what turned out to be multiple reports being written by a number of experts in various different important areas to the work of the inquiry. These reports came from a number of individuals and were originally intended to deal with the broad question of structural discrimination, not only within the UK as a whole, but also within Scotland. In the end, the reports and evidence presented by numerous expert witnesses, from whom you heard in Module 2, not only addressed those points, but also touched upon a number of what they perceived to be failings under sections entitled Missed Opportunities and Lessons Learned in their respective areas. And I intend to provide some information about the evidence which was provided by these witnesses, which is also of particular significance in Scotland. Professor James Nasru and Professor Leah Bakaris provided evidence in relation to pre-pandemic inequalities based on race, including the role of structural racism. They expressed the view that while ethnic minority populations were smaller and more geographically concentrated in Scotland compared to England, and data was generally more limited to England alone, the data which they accessed indicated that processes of radicalisation and racism are equally relevant across all 4 nations of the UK. There is no evidence to suggest that they operate differently in the different nations. The evidence which they provided described inequalities in certain communities in various areas, inequalities in health, inequalities in accessing healthcare. They described that social and economic inequalities that faced ethnic minority people, which they faced as we entered the pandemic, such that they had strong potential to lead to different outcomes or exacerbate vulnerabilities. They expressed the view that ethnic minority people should have been identified as a vulnerable group, but that they generally were not. They identified numerous missed opportunities to do this in decision-making in the UK and stressed the failure to engage properly with the ethnic minority community to tailor lockdown provisions to their needs, address digital exclusion, build existing racism into strategies about clinical interventions, and provide enhanced employment safety nets. Professor James Nasru also provided a helpful report in relation to pre-pandemic structural discrimination against elderly people. He was of the view that the evidence produced in his report about later life and ageism and the conclusions drawn were relevant to each nation of the UK. He pointed out that the increased vulnerability of older people to a pandemic caused by a respiratory virus had been thoroughly documented in the past, which is why elderly groups were recommended to have an influenza vaccination. He pointed out that the elderly were more likely to suffer adversely from NPIs as a result of their likelihood to suffer from digital exclusion, social isolation, and reliance on the NHS in relation to other non-COVID health needs. As had been the case in his report on racism, Professor Nasru identified a number of missed opportunities in the UK-wide response as regards the needs of elderly people. He noted that in the early stages of the pandemic, the SAGE committee had asked for evidence on which groups of people were most at risk. He stated that this evidence does not seem to have been produced, and the request did not seem to have been followed up. As far as social care was concerned, he stated that prior to the pandemic, the fragile state of social care had been clearly documented. The failure to build resilience and quality into the social care sector including adequate rewards and security for the workforce, was inevitably going to lead to crisis during a pandemic. Thus, robust infection control measures, in his view, in care homes were necessary. Professor Thomas Shakespeare and Professor Nicholas Watson, provided a similar report in relation to people with disabilities. Their report drew on significant evidence from Scotland. They offered the view, based on that evidence, that disabled people were particularly vulnerable. Disability entails a strong age, and that disability entails a strong age gradient. In total, approximately half of people significantly affected by disability were over 60. In particular, it was known that people with intellectual disabilities were more susceptible to severe outcomes from viral infections and other respiratory infections or disorders more broadly. In particular, Scottish research from 2018 had shown that people with intellectual disabilities have as many health conditions at 20 and over as the rest of the population aged 50 and over, live 20 years less than their non-disabled peers. Like others, they presented an analysis of missed opportunities and impacts of the pandemic, in their case, on the disabled community. This analysis shows that the increased vulnerabilities to COVID faced by disabled people led to disproportionate impact, particularly on people with intellectual disabilities, including data from Scotland, which in their words shows much higher risk of infection, severe infection and mortality amongst those with intellectual disabilities. The pandemic, in their view, placed extra burden on already overburdened services. There was also a failure to take account of the impact of poverty on disabled people and to foresee the issues this would cause, particularly digital exclusion. Professor Leah Bakares also provided evidence in relation to the members of the LGBTQ+ community. She gave oral evidence and spoke also of stark inequalities across the UK in that community. She reported significant missed opportunities in the management of the pandemic across the UK. She expressed the view that due to increased prevalence of pre-existing physical and mental health conditions, LGBTQ+ people, particularly those who are disabled from minority ethnic groups or younger and older LGBTQ+ people, should have been identified as a particularly vulnerable group, and measures should have been adapted and adopted to reduce their risk of infection. Similarly, Dr. Claire Wenham gave evidence in relation to gender inequalities. Again, she commented that there were similar gender-based inequalities prior to the pandemic, although it is fair to say that she had pointed out that prior to the pandemic, Scotland had been a leader in mainstreaming across government departments. Again, she pointed out a number of missed opportunities during the course of the pandemic, which disproportionately affected women, in particular in the areas of mental health, domestic violence, and in particular health areas with which women tended to be more connected. Professor David Taylor Robinson gave a similar report in relation to children. Again, he presented evidence of deteriorating child health in the period before the pandemic, and inequalities in child and adolescent mental health in particular. He stated that there were several missed opportunities as regards children, and that policies should have targeted broader factors influencing outcomes, including the material environment, including digital access, and promoting a rich environment in which children could learn through play, and a number of matters relating to children's mental health not generally addressed during the course of the pandemic. There is, in addition to this evidence, my lady, a good deal of evidence which is already available to this module. You will recall, and will have had summaries and had evidence in Module 2, that the inquiry has commissioned what is now a large body of evidence from a number of groups across the UK, relating, first of all, to the impact on the particular groups in question, but also to the experiences of those groups during the course of the pandemic. Though some of these relate predominantly to other areas of the UK, some of the organisations which have responded are UK-wide, and indeed there are a number which have provided specific Rule 9 responses in this regard to Module 2A. There are a number of threads which I think we can bring together from these responses, which, in addition to the moving impact film, give us a useful insight into the impact of the pandemic on these various sectors, but also on the particular problems experienced. I will summarise some of these for your benefit this morning, my lady. The evidence suggests that there was a lack of effective consultation with representatives of impact groups by the Scottish Government, in particular in the initial stages of the pandemic, but also after the Scottish Government's 4 harm strategy, to which I will return, was devised, which ostensibly sought to consider and mitigate the effect of countermeasures, despite the fact that there was a membership of many campaign or impact organisations on Scottish Government advisory or expert committees. One of the witnesses whom you heard this morning, you will remember, who had suffered from pre-existing mental health difficulties, explained that nobody took stock and said, who have we missed? That, my lady, will be a significant theme of the evidence which we will explore in this module, in particular looking not only at the area which has been covered in considerable detail in the early months of the pandemic, but the extent to which, as the pandemic went on during the course of our scope, the extent to which the Scottish Government in particular learned lessons from what it had experienced before and applied those lessons effectively. Furthermore, my lady, the evidence suggests there was a lack of account being taken by the Scottish Government of the needs of and effects of the pandemic on particular groups, regarding the particular and disproportionate effects of the virus on them, the particular and disproportionate effects of countermeasures, the NPIs on certain groups, and the support or care which would normally have been provided to that group, which could not be due to the pandemic, such as medical care, social services, or social work report. Furthermore, my lady, the evidence suggests there was a lack of funding for particular needs based on the increased needs created by the virus, for example, a lack of funding for social care. Generally, a number of organisations suggest that there may have been a lack of ability to get action on certain required initiatives due to the devolution settlement and the need for funding for certain things to come from the UK Treasury. The extent to which the Scottish Government's advisory subgroups, which sought to provide an opportunity for engagement with impact organisations, actually provided information or advice which was taken into account in decision-making at all, is something we will look at. In particular, the Black and Minority Infrastructure Scotland Group, BMIS, found that the Scottish Government's expert advisory group, in which they were concerned on ethnicity, even struggled to reach an adequate definition of ethnic minority and was overly dominated by academic views. The extent to which there was adequate communication of the rules, guidance, reasons for those rules to at-risk and vulnerable people in Scotland via public communication, via various limitations on their ability to receive it, is a consistent theme amongst the evidence we have. The extent to which reliance was placed on voluntary or charitable organisations by government to inform their understanding of the needs of these communities is also significant and suggests that perhaps those were not well understood at the beginning of the pandemic. Further, evidence suggests there was in certain places a lack of data for certain groups, given that there appeared to be no pre-existing system for collecting data on those groups. Some have reported that this meant it was difficult to prove particular impacts and losses to government, and meant that there was a requirement to make cases for additional help, for additional effort, for additional attention, based on more anecdotal reporting, which proved difficult. Overall, a number of organisations suggested that there was inadequate access to social care and understanding about the particular rules in that regard. My lady, I intend now to turn to providing something of a summary of some of the relevant expert evidence which you heard in Module 2. We will, I think, be having a short break. That would be an appropriate moment for me to break, if that's a convenient moment for you.
Thank you very much, Mr Dawson. Yes, for those who haven't been following our proceedings so far, we take a break every 90 minutes or so for the benefit of the stenographer and others. So I shall return at 11:30.
reduced economic activity by about 10%, and increased wage inequality and poverty. Additionally, prolonged and strict NPIs increased gender inequalities, in his view, because the pandemic had hit more severely contact-intensive sectors where women tended to be overrepresented, and intergovernmental inequalities, and intergenerational inequalities, because older people had more savings and tended to receive stable retirement income, whereas young workers typically relied on their job earnings, which were more likely to be affected by lockdown measures. You have also heard evidence, my lady, equally relevant to this module, as you have heard in the tributes and the testimony in the video this morning, from long COVID experts who have explained to you the nature of the condition and also its emergence across the period with which we are concerned. These experts have pointed out in their testimony the fact that in Scotland, the Scottish Government invested £10 million for health boards to support local services for long COVID, and that in a paper dated the 30th September 2021, the Scottish Government set out its approach to supporting those with long COVID in Scotland. In their report, these experts expressed the view that not having hibernating studies or planned follow-up in clinical care with embedded research meant that there was significant delay in starting the research studies into long COVID during the first wave of the pandemic, despite studies having been designed, protocols written, and governance approved at unprecedented speed. They concluded that long COVID was foreseeable, but that it would remain a major health problem. They said that there was and is minimal focus on preparedness for the long-term consequences of viral outbreaks like COVID, and insufficient surveillance for long COVID was planned at the outset of the pandemic. They say that there was insufficient research and clinical services planned when COVID struck. My lady, that concludes my summary of the evidence which you've heard to this point, which is no doubt very familiar to you, although perhaps less familiar to some of our audience, in the hope that it provides some useful context to some of the matters with which we will be concerned. You have obviously, my lady, heard enormous volumes of evidence about the UK government decision-making, both in oral and written form. I do not intend at this stage to go into that. It would take me weeks to summarise it. However, it is our intention in this module, where significant as regards Scottish decision-making, to put matters that were raised by UK government ministers, advisers and others to Scottish ministers, advisers and others in this module. To turn then, my lady, to the analysis of the pandemic in Scotland. The ebb and flow of the pandemic in Scotland was in some regards similar to the way in which the pandemic was experienced elsewhere in the UK. The arrival of the virus, the waves of infection, the effects of variants are all elements of the pandemic which have certain common features on both sides of the border. However, there are many significant differences in that regard and in the way that transmission was handled by key decision makers. I intend to set out a chronology of the key events which shaped the way that the pandemic developed in Scotland, highlighting as I go along the key decisions which we intend to analyse, as well as the key issues which we have, to this point, identified as being key to the analysis of the reasonableness of the Scottish governmental response. Of course, as was the case in Module 2, this is a political module, and we will focus on the key political decisions, the strategy which is adopted by the government in Scotland to fight the virus, its coherence, its basis on the available evidence, and its effectiveness. The module scope starts where Module 1 left off, namely in January 2020. At this stage, as the M1 evidence shows, although Scotland had its own Minister for Resilience, part of the portfolio of the Deputy First Minister at the time, John Swinney, the Scottish Government's ability to react to the early emerging signs of danger was largely bound to the emergency structures at UK government level. The evidence gathered by the inquiry shows, however, that at some point during the first lockdown in the response to the pandemic, the Scottish Government developed its own structures, both for decision-making and for advice. This resulted in the Scottish Government pursuing its own strategies to fight the virus, its own regulations and restrictions, and its own mechanisms for communicating with the public about them. The inquiry has already looked at the key questions in M2 of whether the UK government reacted with sufficient speed in the early months of 2020 on learning of the emergence of the virus in China, whether it was provided with the right information to enable it to do so. These questions equally apply in Module 2A when looking at the Scottish Government response. Given the Scottish Government's later adoption of a more autonomous approach, ought it to have taken heed of earlier advice received directly from experts or via UK government systems to which it had access, like COBRA and SAGE? Given the differences in health and age profile in Scotland and its pre-existing autonomous structures to deal with a public health emergency, ought it to have done more to make plans to deal with the virus earlier? Ought it to have done more to seek to influence the decision-makers in key positions within the UK government in the best interests of the people of Scotland? Had the Scottish Government taken a different approach, it may have been able in these early months to alter the course of the pandemic significantly. Some may suggest that it ought to have done so, despite the limitations on its ability to do so in the pre-existing UK constitutional framework. Evidence heard by Your Ladyship in Module 2 has covered in great detail the events of the first few months of the pandemic leading to the first lockdown. I do not intend to rehearse that evidence here, though many of the issues which were ventilated had either a direct or indirect effect on Scotland, given the broad Four Nations approach, which appears to have been adopted over that period. I will focus here, as we will in the module more generally, on the particularly Scottish elements. The evidence heard there in Module 2 indicates that from the very early days of January 2020, it was clear that UK government scientists and medical officers, including the Scottish Government's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Catherine Calderwood, were already in communication with one another and with a number of external academic scientists about a new viral pneumonia outbreak. On the 9th of January, the WHO issued a statement concerning a cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan. On the 21st of January, the WHO published its first novel coronavirus 2019 nCoV report. By the 22nd of January, the first SAGE group meeting was activated on a precautionary basis by the UK CSA. The minutes recorded that there is evidence of person-to-person transmission. They also recorded that the UK currently has good centralised diagnostic capacity and is days away from a specific test, which is scalable across the UK in weeks. On the 24th of January, COBRA, the Cabinet Office Briefing Room Crisis Committee, met for the first time. COBRA agrees a series of actions to be put in place when certain trigger points were reached, and that these trigger points be shared quickly with the CMOs for all four nations. The UK CMOs met. The Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Ms Jean Freeman, attended this first COVID-19 related COBRA meeting. The First Minister of Scotland did not. On the 25th of January, 5 people had been tested for COVID in Scotland, all returning negative results, as an incident team was established for the disease. It was reported that one of the patients was a Chinese student who was being treated in Edinburgh, and that the man was thought to have become unwell after visiting family in Wuhan. Professor Jürgen Haas, Edinburgh University's head of infection medicine, was reported as having said that it was very likely that cases would be confirmed in the UK, pointing out that here at the University of Edinburgh, we have more than 2,000 students from China, and they are always coming and going back to China. So we are relatively sure that we will have cases in the UK from travellers coming back from China. He warned that the spread of the virus might increase as more people travelled around for Chinese New Year within China and to other countries. Professor Mark Woolhouse, Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at the University of Edinburgh, wrote to the Scottish CMO, stating, if you were to put those numbers into an epidemiological model for Scotland and many other countries, you would likely predict that over about a year, at least half the population will become infected. The gross mortality rate will triple, more at the epidemic peak, and the health system will become completely overwhelmed. Please note that this is not a worst-case scenario. This is based on the WHO's central estimates and currently available evidence. The worst-case scenario is considerably worse. On the 27th of January, Health Protection Scotland initiated the Incident and Emergency Response Plan. This implemented response arrangements, including the structure and governance of the incident response going forward, and the establishment of an incident room at the Meridian Court offices in Glasgow. The emergency response coordinator was Dr. Jim McMenamin, from whom we will hear later this week. On the 29th of January, the Scottish Government activated its Scottish Government Operational Response Room, or SCORE. The first SCORE M, the Ministerial Forum of SCORE meeting, was chaired by the First Minister on that date. By way of context, MSPs also voted 64 to 54 to back calls for a second Scottish independence referendum. On the 30th of January, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern, or FEIC. The UK current risk level was raised from low to moderate. On this day too, the first case of infection with the virus in the UK was confirmed. 2 members of the same family, one a 23-year-old Chinese student who had travelled back to York from a family home in Hubei. On the 31st of January, the novel coronavirus was discussed in the UK Cabinet for the first time. A number of questions arise. What information was received, understood, assimilated and acted upon by government in Scotland in the period before the lockdown? Was the fact that the virus would inevitably spread to Scotland, given its international connections and land border with England, properly appreciated by the Scottish Government? Were the consequences of the likely lack of efforts made to control the virus adequately understood? What role did Scotland expect to play in the overall UK resilience response? Was this role the right one to have adopted? Why did the lesson to act quickly not appear to have been part of the initial thinking? Did previous pandemic experiences or the fact of the WHO not declaring a FEIC until the 30th of January cause an unduly relaxed approach? As to the practical aspects of the response, what consideration was given to the state of Scotland's preparedness in light of previous recommendations for this type of threat, which had apparently not been acted upon? What analysis was done of Scotland's own capacity and responsibility, acting alone and within the UK context? What capacity was there for diagnostic testing or procurement of PPE? Who was deemed to be most at risk? What was done to protect them? What analysis was done of the likely capacity of testing, contact tracing and isolation to keep the infection under control? What was done to put them in place? On the 4th of February, the WHO issued guidance recommending scaling up country preparedness and response operations. On the 10th of February 2020, 57 tests have been conducted in Scotland, all were negative. On the 10th of February, also, a team of epidemiologists at Imperial College provided a first estimate of the severity of the virus, giving an overall case fatality rate in all infections, symptomatic or asymptomatic, of around 1%. That is to say, 1 in 100 of every confirmed case, as opposed to those who are infected, would die. PHE started to roll out its Covid-19 diagnostic test to laboratories across the UK. On the 21st of February, news emerged of a cluster of locally transmitted cases in Lombardy, Italy. A lockdown began in Italy, covering 10 municipalities of the province of Lodi in Lombardy and one of the province of Padua. Scotland's men's international rugby team played Italy on the 22nd of February 2020 in Rome. Scotland's women's team had been due to play in Lugano, just outside Milan in the Lombardy region in Italy, on the 23rd of February. The match was cancelled due to local concerns about COVID, though the Scotland team had travelled to northern Italy for the match. On the 22nd of February, passengers from the cruise ship the Diamond Princess arrived back in the UK. The Diamond Princess had been quarantined on the 3rd of February by the Japanese government after a passenger from Hong Kong tested positive for COVID-19 after having earlier left the ship on the 25th of January. Of the some 2,600 passengers and 1,000 crew, over 500 people became infected. Early reports showed, however, that around 18% of the people infected had shown no symptoms. How was the possibility of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread factored into the thinking and planning within Scottish Government? By the 25th of February 2020, 412 tests had been carried out in Scotland, all negative. There was a COVID-19 outbreak at the Nike conference, which took place in Edinburgh on the 25th and 26th of February 2020, from which at least 25 people linked to the event were thought to have contracted the virus, including 8 residents of Scotland. This conference and the extent to which the dangers associated with it were known about around the time it took place within Scottish Government, as well as the steps taken to control the risk and to inform the public about the dangers associated with it, will be examined during the course of this module. On the 2nd of March, it was reported that Health Protection Scotland had been alerted by international authorities about a person not from the UK who had tested positive after the conference in late February. Despite this, the public were not told. Further details of the extent to which the conference posed a risk to the Scottish public and the extent of what they had not been told emerged in the spring of 2020 via press reporting. These will also be explored within the module. COBRA met again on the 28th of February, by which time the UK had reported its first case of confirmed community transmission. On the 29th of February, the total number of confirmed cases in the UK rose to 23 after 10,483 people had been tested. Is it correct to say that the evidence shows that information about the nature and hence the threat of the... It is correct to say that the evidence shows that the information about the nature and hence the threat from the virus emerged over time. However, it might be said that it is inevitable in situations of this nature that information will be limited and will not ever meet the standard of conclusive proof, meaning that the imperative to act will always be based on incomplete or non-ideal information. We will examine the extent to which Scottish ministers did what they could to equip themselves with the information which was available and assess when it was reasonable for them to act. Should they have known more? Should they have acted more quickly in response to the emerging lethal threat? Given the increasing awareness of the threat of the new virus, to which I will return, we will examine the powers that the Scottish ministers had and their apparent decision not to impose different suppression strategies before the national lockdown on the 23rd of March 2020. Your Ladyship has heard evidence in Module 2 of delay and indecision in February 2020 within the UK Government. In light of the emerging threat, why did the Scottish ministers not take or seek to persuade the UK Government of the need to take swifter decisive action, including ramping up testing capacity, other surveillance systems and supplies of protective equipment, in particular in light of their prior failure to implement resilience strategies looked at in Module 1? Was the inevitable spread of the virus after the end of January properly appreciated by the Scottish Government, the body with responsibility for protecting Scotland? As at the 1st of March 2020, the first case of coronavirus in Scotland was confirmed. By that time, according to Professor Woolhouse, community transmission had already started. On the same date, Scotland's Chief Medical Officer, Dr Calderwood, announced that surveillance would begin at some hospitals and 41 GP surgeries in the nation. On Monday, the 2nd of March, the Prime Minister chaired a COBRA meeting for the first time. It was also attended by the First Minister of Scotland. The WHO raised its alert to very high. On the 3rd of March 2020, the UK Government's Coronavirus Action Plan launched. We intend to investigate what knowledge of or input into that plan the Scottish ministers had. How suitable was it for Scotland? What consideration had there been of Scottish matters, risks and requirements? It will be important to consider over this period the extent to which the Scottish Government considered its role to develop its own strategy to combat the virus in the exercise of its responsibility for the devolved area of public health. To what extent did it understand, interpret for the good of Scotland and seek to influence the containment strategy which was followed in the early part of March? What realistic chance did it have to succeed given the known characteristics of the virus? What role did the pursuit of herd immunity play in the Scottish plans? By the 4th of March, 2 further cases in Scotland were confirmed, one having travelled from Italy and the other having had contact with a known carrier. By the 5th of March, 3 further cases were confirmed, taking the total to 6. By the 6th of March, the number of confirmed cases in Scotland rose to 11. By the 7th of March, cases in Italy had risen 5-fold to 5,800, and deaths had risen 8-fold in 6 days to 233. On the 8th of March, further proposed measures to curb the spread of Covid-19 were announced. In Italy, the quarantine was extended to all of Lombardy and 14 other northern provinces, and then on the 9th of March to the whole country. On the 8th of March 2020, Scotland played France in a rugby union international at Murrayfield Stadium in Edinburgh. France had been the first country in Europe to have reported an official death from Covid-19 on the 15th of February 2020. On the same day as the rugby, France had banned mass gatherings of over 1,000 people. France would go into national lockdown on the 17th of March 2020, 6 days before the UK. The previous day, the scheduled Scotland against France women's game had been cancelled as a player had tested positive for Covid. On the 9th of March 2020, cases had more than doubled again in Scotland to 23 cases. The 8th meeting of COBRA took place, chaired by the PM. The DHSC in the UK government circulated a report to Number 10 showing that NHS demand would greatly exceed capacity by 240,000 beds or 19,000 ICU beds if the government were to implement the measures then under consideration. The 14th meeting of SAGE took place. PHE was informed of the first Covid-19 outbreak in care homes. PHE data presented at SAGE suggested that the true number of cases was 5,000 to 10,000 infections, but maybe as many as 30,000. On the 11th of March 2020, the WHO declared Covid-19 a pandemic. On that date, the first case of community transmission, which was not linked to contact or travel, was confirmed in Scotland. There had been 36 positive tests. Scotland remained in the containment phase of its management strategy. On the 13th of March 2020, the first death from coronavirus in Scotland was confirmed. Little information about the circumstances of the death were released by the Scottish Government, other than to say that the individual who had died was a man who had existing health complications and had been under the care of NHS Lothian. It was later reported that he was a French national who had come to Edinburgh for the Rugby International on the 8th of March. By the 13th of March, positive tests had risen to 85. On the 12th of March, the Scottish Government announced that all indoor and outdoor mass events of 500 people or more should be cancelled. It was emphasised by the First Minister that the Scottish Government at that time had no power to compel the cancellation of such events, and that her announcement about cancellation was in the form of guidance only. What was the Scottish Government's thinking behind the issuing of this guidance? How did it consider it to fit in with the UK strategy? Why were the measures recommended in Scotland at this time thought to be the best course for the nation? What consideration was applied to alternative strategies? Why were they not taken? What lessons were learned from the pattern in Italy, France, Spain or London, where the pandemic's effects were seen earlier than in Scotland? Did delay cost lives? On the same day, Scotland's CMO advised that people with symptoms suggestive of coronavirus, a fever or new cough, should stay at home from 7 days from that Friday. She advised that those who had been in contact with someone experiencing symptoms should only stay at home if they began to experience symptoms themselves. On the 15th of March, the Scottish Government judged that containment of the virus was no longer possible and the country should be moving into the delay phase. This meant that rather than trying to stop the virus altogether, the focus switched to trying to manage its spread through the population. Contact tracing was no longer a priority, and testing resources were directed towards hospitalised patients instead of being used to identify new cases in the community. By the 16th of March, the 4 new ministerial implementation groups were established to aid collective government decision-making. Imperial College published Report 9, which models the potential impact of stringent conditions and concludes that epidemic suppression was the only viable strategy at that time. The model used to produce Report 9 generated a worst-case scenario of over 500,000 deaths in the UK by the end of July 2020. On the 17th of March 2020, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Ms Jean Freeman, told MPs the NHS in Scotland would be placed on an emergency footing for 3 months, with non-urgent elective operations being cancelled. On the same day, in a keynote address to the Scottish Parliament, the First Minister said that life will change significantly and emphasised the need for every citizen to reduce all non-essential social contact. She further explained that everyone should minimise social contact as much as possible, avoiding crowded areas and gatherings, including bars, restaurants and cinemas, use public transport as little as possible, and also to work from home if possible. She stated that the advice applied especially strongly to people who are over 70, people with underlying health conditions for which they got the flu vaccine, and pregnant women. They were strongly advised to stay at home as much as possible. She also stated that steps would be taken to shield the most vulnerable, which was limited to those with compromised immune systems. On the 19th of March, the Deputy First Minister announced that the Scottish Government was advising that at the end of the following day, schools and nurseries should ordinarily close for children and young people. Also, on the 18th of March, the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Mr Michael Russell, sent a letter to Michael Gove, Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, setting out the Scottish Government's intention to pause campaigning for a second independence referendum in light of the coronavirus threat. The extent to which the approach to the management of the pandemic was influenced by the Scottish Government's key objective of achieving independence for Scotland is also an issue which we will seek to address in the module. On the 20th of March 2020, the Scottish Government told cafes, pubs and restaurants to close, as well as other similar establishments. The Scottish Government's website indicated these establishments were being told to close, but in an address by the Chief Medical Officer, she indicated that they were only being asked to do so. On the 22nd of March 2020, the First Minister of Scotland gave her first daily media briefing. On the 23rd of March, with the UK death toll hitting 335 deaths, with 14 in Scotland, the Prime Minister announced a nationwide stay-at-home order would come into effect as of midnight and that it would be reviewed every 3 weeks. The Scottish Government also announced a full national lockdown, closure of hospitality and non-essential retail, a requirement to stay at home, work from home where possible, and restrictions on indoor and outdoor gatherings. These restrictions came into legal force when the Scottish Parliament gave consent to the Coronavirus Act 2020 on the 25th of March. We will examine in this module the powers and the strategy of the Scottish Government with regard to the management of the pandemic over this period, the reasons why it acted as it did and why it did not do more, how it perceived its role as against that of the UK Government, its access to advice and the limitations on that. We will ask whether the Scottish Government could and should have done more over this period to protect the people of Scotland from the virus. By the time we reach March, to what extent had there been inadequate engagement by key decision makers in the process, and hence a failure to progress protections when they were needed? To what extent did the Scottish Government have power to do something about it? What was their role in the UK Government's decision-making process over this period? What role did the possibility of the collapse of Scotland's NHS, the possibility of a second peak, have in decision-making? Was enough done by the Scottish Government to protect the Scottish people, given its responsibility for the health of the nation? Was Scotland's voice, given its particular characteristics, heard? Why did Scotland go into lockdown on the 23rd of March? Who made that decision and why? Could and should earlier measures have been taken, either in the form of an earlier lockdown or alternative social distancing measures, in a bid to regain control? On the 25th of March, the Scottish Government made a declaration of serious and imminent threat to public health under Schedules 21 and 22 of the 2020 Act. The role of the Scottish Government in the settlement of how powers would be allocated amongst the governments of the UK, and the extent to which consideration was given to how these new powers would be exercised and coordinated, will also be addressed in the module. Further, on the 25th of March, the First Minister confirmed that the Scottish Government would establish its own COVID-19 advisory group to supplement the advice which it already received from SAGE. We will examine the role of this group in the overall divergence of the Scottish Government policy from the priorities and strategy of the UK Government, the reasons for that, and the reasonableness of such divergence in the context of a global viral pandemic. I will return to the theme of divergence in due course. I will also return to particular aspects of the Scottish Government's advisory structures which were devised during the course of the pandemic in Scotland in due course. There will be particular focus in this module on the role which the Scottish Government played over this period with regard to the protection of individuals within care homes or cared for at home. On the 26th of March 2020, the Scottish Government produced clinical guidance for the management of clients assessing care at home, housing support and sheltered housing. On the 27th of March, the Scottish Government published rules on staying at home and social distancing, which now required to be followed in terms of powers from the Westminster Coronavirus Act 2020. The Scottish Government used those powers to make it a criminal offence not to follow its social distancing rules. People in Scotland were only permitted to go outside if they had a reasonable excuse. On the 1st of April, construction started at the SEC in Glasgow on what was to become the NHS Louisa Jordan, Scotland's Nightingale Hospital. On the 5th of April, the Scottish Government's CMO, Dr Calderwood, resigned as a result of revelations that she had broken lockdown rules to visit her holiday home. In this module, we will examine the circumstances in which this resignation occurred and its management by the Scottish Government, including the way in which it was presented to the Scottish public. On the 6th of April 2020, the Coronavirus Scotland Act, introduced as an emergency bill in the Scottish Parliament on the 31st of March, gained royal assent, becoming law. On the 17th of April, the Scottish Government announced the establishment of an independent advisory group set up to provide expert economic advice to the Scottish Government. On the 20th of April, the NHS Louisa Jordan in Glasgow opened as confirmed cases passed 8,400, with 915 fatalities having been recorded in hospitals. On the 21st of April, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport, Jean Freeman, announced a change in the Scottish Government strategy towards the management of infection in care homes. Scottish Government guidance on isolation care homes had been in place since the 13th of March, requiring clear social distancing, active infection prevention and control, and an end to communal activity. The extent to which there had been any proper assessment of the capacity of the care sector to deliver on this guidance will be undertaken in the module. The reasons why these measures had not been introduced before this point, the consequence of the Scottish Government's failure to do so, and the effectiveness of these measures once they were introduced will be considered in this module as a part of the Scottish Government's overall Covid-19 management strategy and in light of the high burden of infection and death in the care sector in Scotland. On the 22nd of April 2020, the National Records of Scotland released data up to the 19th of April, which gave some context to the change in strategy which Ms Freeman had announced the day before. The number of deaths from any cause in Scotland was up 80% above the 5-year average. 537 deaths on death certificates had been recorded in care homes, double the number of the previous week. 910 deaths recorded on death certificates have been recorded in hospitals and 168 deaths in homes or other settings. In addition, it was reported that Public Health Scotland's daily figures were undercounting these deaths, even at those rates. On the 23rd of April 2020, the Scottish Government published details of its strategy for ending lockdown, the Covid-19, a framework for decision-making document. The stated aim of this strategy was to suppress the virus so that the R number remained below 1. Demands on the NHS did not exceed capacity, and people were able to return to some semblance of normality. The document set out the position during lockdown and outlined the factors that would be considered as the country moved gradually to ease restrictions. This constituted the basis of the Scottish Government's 4 harms strategy to the ongoing management of the pandemic in Scotland, which was aimed at Scotland's transition out of the lockdown. I mentioned earlier the theme of divergence of Scottish Government policy in the management of the pandemic from that of the UK Government, which we will examine in the module. It appears to us, on the evidence currently available, that although the seeds of divergence were sown at the time of the creation of the powers for the Scottish Government to impose its restrictions, which could be enforced by force of criminal sanctions in late March, and the formation of the Covid-19 advisory group at the same time, the framework announced at this time, in April, represented a clear statement of intent to adopt a wholly distinct Scottish policy. The strategy which was announced by the Scottish Government at that time involved, amongst other things, the creation of a multiplicity of new advisory committees. New decision-making structures within Scottish Government also emerged, including the 4 Harms Group, based on the 4 Harms strategy, though it did not meet until October. The extent to which the development of these new advisory and decision-making bodies, created in the heat of the pandemic, as opposed to relying on strict structures which had predated it, will be examined in the module. Equally, changes were made to the internal structures of the Scottish Government's pre-existing Directorate system to cater for the response. The Directorate General for the Constitution and External Affairs took on the main coordination function in the Scottish Government's response to Covid-19. These included organisation of COVID business, Four Nations liaison, legislation, regulations and guidance, as well as travel restrictions. Within it sat various new directorates, the role of which we will examine. Within the Scottish Government's Directorate General for Health and Social Care, a COVID response team was set up by Scottish Government in the week commencing the 16th of March to focus on the emergency response for people who were considered most vulnerable to COVID. It was in place by the end of the week commencing the 23rd of March and operated until the 31st of May 2020. Further structural alterations were numerous and included new directorates, divisional and advisory structures being created under the auspices of the Director General for Health and Social Care and its existing directorate structure. These changes also included the following for decision-making or to assist decision-making in addition to the Scottish Cabinet. SCORE, the Scottish Government Resilience Room, was, as you heard in Module 1, an existing means by which the Scottish Government dealt with emergencies through its Resilience Division. SCORE as an entity did not make decisions, but enabled relevant parties to come together to make decisions and coordinated their activity. Its specific activation for the COVID-19 pandemic occurred on the 29th of January 2020. In addition, meetings in which the First Minister and/or Deputy First Minister and occasionally other Cabinet Secretaries would meet with senior policy advisers became colloquially known within the Scottish Government as GOLD or Gold Type or Gold Command meetings. These would typically take place over the weekend or on the Monday immediately before Cabinet, which tended to meet on a Tuesday. It appears that no minutes of the meetings of this group were kept. The Four Harms Group, which met from October 2020, though the Scottish Government Four Harms strategy with which it was connected had been in place from April 2020, on a weekly basis from that point, it considered the current and potential future state of the epidemic and any measures under consideration, including any legal restrictions or requirements. It tended to prepare a paper on a Friday, which the Deputy First Minister would present to Cabinet at its Tuesday meeting the following week, setting out the issues and relevant analysis, and usually, but not always, making specific recommendations. As I've said, my lady, we have intimated to core participants a note by the inquiry team, setting out the evidence we have gathered about the identity of key individuals involved in the pandemic response and the key elements of these decision-making systems. In the hope that that will be of assistance to their navigation amongst the obvious complexity of these structures. We will examine how key decisions were made by which individuals, bodies and directorates within that complex structure. We will examine the identity of the decision makers and the changes to these structures and bodies and to decision-making practice, why these changes were made and the appropriateness and effectiveness of them. In assessing the effectiveness of the pre-existing and altered decision-making practices and structures, we will examine the effectiveness of systems and practices designed to facilitate effective communication, discussion and information sharing between those making key strategic decisions within government in response to the pandemic. Those strategies related to discussions between ministers in the Scottish Government, between ministers in the Scottish Government and their advisers, both medical and administrative, and between Scottish Government ministers and other government decision makers, including ministers in the UK Government. They also concerned communications between Scottish Government ministers and key representatives of those affected by this pandemic within Scottish society. These new structures evolved gradually. These new advisory and decision-making structures upon which reliance was placed tended to be more Scottish Government entities, such as the Four Harms Group, the Scottish COVID Advisory Group and its subcommittees, and other advisory bodies providing advice beyond the management of COVID-19 infection, which inevitably meant moves away from the structures which had existed before the pandemic. Those tended to be more UK-based, such as COBRA or SAGE. Whether the creation of these brand new Scottish systems was a reasonable approach in the face of a virus which did not respect man-made administrative boundaries will be considered, as will new structures which sought to maintain some level of cross-border coordination, such as the Four Nations meetings led on behalf of the UK Government by Michael Gove. Connected to this, we will examine the extent to which divergence by the Scottish Government from the UK Government approach and systems was based on proper advice and a reasonable balancing of the competing considerations, whether there was truly separate Scottish evidence which could and should be used to justify a separate, different Scottish approach, whether points of difference were substantive or merely cosmetic, whether they led to different outcomes, and whether they were to any extent motivated by factors other than the very best response to the virus for the safety of the people of Scotland. By the 5th of May, further information about the framework for decision-making was released. This was issued in the context of what were described as signs of hope, not least in the declining numbers of people requiring intensive care or treatment as a result of the virus. In updating the details of the assessment mechanism, the document issued on the 5th of May identified the means by which advice was taken to inform the four harms approach. On the 7th of May, the Scottish Government announced that it had reached its testing goal of 3,500 tests a day in NHS labs laid out in April, with 4,661 tests carried out on the 30th of April. They also announced that their next target was 8,000 tests a day in NHS labs across Scotland by mid-May. The four harms-based framework had acknowledged the importance of testing as part of the surveillance strategy to monitor cases. We will examine in this module the extent to which testing strategy was prioritised sufficiently, predominantly but not exclusively in the early months of our scope. On the same day, the 7th of May, the First Minister extended the lockdown restrictions in Scotland for another 3 weeks, but said they could be changed if evidence emerged that it was safe to do so. On the 8th of May, the First Minister reported that with some recognition that each of the four nations of the UK might move at different speeds with regard to loosening the lockdown, and that she would not be pressured into lifting restrictions prematurely. On the 10th of May, about which you have heard in Module 2, the UK Government updated its coronavirus message from stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, to stay alert, control the virus, save lives. The leaders of the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland said that they would keep the original slogan. The messaging represented a significant divergence in strategy on the part of the UK and Scottish governments, the former signalling a move towards easing the lockdown and the latter sticking with the existing restrictions, in effect taking the view that the fight against the first harm, the harm caused by the virus itself, remained the priority. By way of explanation of the Scottish Government's position, on the 11th of May, in a national address to Scotland at the beginning of the 7th week of lockdown, Nicola Sturgeon asked the nation to stick with lockdown for a bit longer so that we can consolidate our progress, not jeopardise it. She declared that I won't risk unnecessary deaths by acting rashly or prematurely. As of the 11th of May, people could go outside more than once a day to exercise in Scotland. This activity was to continue to be undertaken close to home and was to be done alone or with members of the same household. A second Coronavirus Scotland Bill was introduced to the Scottish Parliament. It included emergency measures to protect people facing financial hardship and allow public services to operate effectively in response to the pandemic. On the 17th of May, the Scottish Government published guidance for arrangements that care homes should put in place to improve professional oversight of care provided during the pandemic. A report from the University of Edinburgh has said that 50% of all Covid-related deaths in Scotland between March and June 2020 had involved care home residents. The report from the University of Edinburgh said that 50% of the Covid-related deaths in Scotland between March and June 2020 had involved the residents. On the 21st of May 2020, the Scottish Government published a more detailed four-phase route map laying out the order in which restrictions would be relaxed. These measures included allowing people to meet up outside with people from one household in the first phase. It was announced that lockdown could be eased from the 28th of May, which it subsequently was, subject to the numbers continuing to fall. It was announced that schools would reopen on the 11th of August, when students would receive a blended model of part-time, until which time students would receive a blended model of part-time study and learning at home. Mid-August, I should say, my lady, is around the traditional time for schools to return after the summer holidays in Scotland, unlike in England when they tend to break up and return later. The details of this route map were subsequently revised on the 18th of June, the 2nd of July, the 9th of July, the 20th of August and the 10th of September, as further evidence emerged of the effectiveness of restrictions on reducing transmission. On the 11th of May, on the 26th of May, 2020, the Scottish Government announced plans for Test and Protect, its testing and contact tracing system. Though again the details of the testing and tracing systems in Scotland will require to wait until later modules of the inquiry, the role of testing in the Scottish Government's strategy in the fight against the virus and its capacity to deliver it will be examined here. On the 28th of May, Nicola Sturgeon announced an easing of lockdown measures in Scotland the following day, when people from 2 different households could meet up outdoors as long as they were in groups of 8 or less. On the 7th of June, no new deaths were recorded in Scotland over the most recent 24-hour period. This was the first time Scotland had recorded no new deaths since lockdown began in March. On the 19th of June, Scotland entered the second phase of its route map. The Scottish Government replaced its stay-at-home message with stay safe. On the 22nd of June, the wearing of face coverings became compulsory on public transport, with exemptions made for children under 5 and people with certain medical conditions. On the 24th of June, the Scottish Government published an updated route map with indicative dates for Phase 2 and 3 measures, announcing major changes to lockdown restrictions. On the 26th of June, Scotland recorded no new deaths or new cases of COVID for the most recent 24-hour period. Nicola Sturgeon predicted that Scotland was not far away from eliminating the virus. On the same day, the Park Inn stabbings took place in Glasgow, an incident in which an asylum seeker was shot dead by police in Glasgow after apparently having stabbed a number of individuals in a city centre hotel in which he had been staying under COVID restrictions. On the 27th of June, travel insurance companies reported that holiday bookings had exploded since the UK Government had announced plans to ease quarantine restrictions on travel abroad. The Scottish Government's position was that it was yet to decide precisely on its view on the matter. Both the external and internal borders will be matters which we will address in this module. In terms of the devolution settlement, the UK Government has authority over border control as a reserved matter, though the general arrangement was the Scottish Government would be consulted on border control and quarantine in Scotland, as these could impact on the devolved area of health. In effect, as we will see, my lady, the Scottish Government seemed to control border policy for Scotland, though this is a matter we will seek to investigate. Travel abroad would later become significant as cases started to rise in late summer and early autumn, to which I'll return. Reports indicated that a Spanish variant of the virus could be associated with as many as 80% of the cases in Scotland. By the 9th of December, Nicola Sturgeon acknowledged in the Scottish Parliament that we should have been much tougher on travel restrictions. This was in the context of a genomic sequencing report provided to SAGE that showed that travel was the main cause of the second wave in Scotland from late summer 2020. On the 29th of June, non-essential retailers were permitted to reopen. On the 8th of July, the Scottish Government announced that passengers arriving from Spain and Serbia would still have to quarantine on arrival, which differed from the UK Government's list of countries exempt from quarantine restrictions. However, on the same date, the Scottish Government announced the lifting of quarantine measures for passengers arriving from 57 overseas destinations and 14 UK overseas territories. On the 3rd of July, Scotland lifted its 5-mile travel restriction. On the 6th of July, beer gardens and pavement cafes were reopened after 15 weeks of lockdown. On the 9th of July, the move to Phase 3 of the Scottish Government's route map out of lockdown was announced. People in Scotland were able to meet up outdoors with 2 other households from the 10th of July and also in extended groups of up to 15. Shopping centres reopened from the 13th of July. On the 10th of July, the wearing of face coverings became mandatory in shops in Scotland, though this rule was not in place in England. On the 15th of July, Scotland recorded its 7th consecutive day without any COVID-19 deaths and had also had 3 days with no admissions to hospital. On the same date, hairdressers and barbers, pubs, restaurants, cinemas, places of worship were allowed to open. Nicola Sturgeon described this as the biggest step so far in the easing of lockdown restrictions. However, no sooner had this important development occurred than the position started to turn. On the 18th of July 2020, Scotland experienced its biggest daily rise in COVID-19 cases since the 21st of June, with 21 cases reported in the most recent 24 hours, 8 of them in the Glasgow and Clyde area. In this context, on the 20th of July, Scotland lifted quarantine restrictions for people arriving from Spain, though on the 26th of July, quarantine restrictions were reimposed on travellers arriving from Spain after a spike in COVID-19 cases. As far as deaths were concerned, the National Record of Scotland figures show that deaths had fallen to their lowest level at this stage since the beginning of the pandemic, with 6 death certificates mentioning the virus in the weekend ending the 19th of July. On the 23rd of July, the Scottish Government announced changes to shielding. On the 29th, the first signs emerged of an issue in Glasgow as a possible COVID-19 cluster was investigated in the city. On the 31st of July, the Scottish Government warned people against visiting areas of England subject to lockdown rules, after measures were imposed by the UK Government there in Greater Manchester and other areas. On the 10th of July, the Scottish Government had given the Scottish Football Association permission to launch the Scottish Premier season on the 1st of August. However, by the 2nd of August, health officials announced they were investigating certain outbreaks, including a cluster of 13 COVID-19 cases linked to a pub in Aberdeen. In this context, Eat Out to Help Out launched on the 3rd of August, including in Scotland. The decision-making process which lay behind the launch of this scheme have been examined in detail in Module 2, not least with the current Prime Minister, Mr Sunak. In accordance with our general remit, we will look at the Scottish perspective on the scheme, which importantly was a UK government initiative, which also applied in Scotland. In early August 2020, the Scottish Government agreed to upgrade thousands of exam results following controversy over their marking and accept teachers' estimates of pupils' results, requiring 75,000 new exam certificates to be issued. On the 11th of August, pupils returned to school for the first time since March, as had been anticipated earlier in the summer. On the 20th of August, the Scottish Government announced that Scotland was to remain in Phase 3 of the route map, as COVID-19 remained a significant threat to public health. The Government published an updated route map setting out new dates for further changes. Aberdeen remained in lockdown until the 23rd of August, when it was partially lifted. Bars and restaurants were allowed to reopen there from the 26th. This was the same date on which Scotland recorded 2 COVID-19 deaths, the first deaths to be recorded since the 16th of July. On the 28th of August, Nicola Sturgeon announced the Scottish Government had been holding talks with business leaders about a phased return to offices. But by the 30th of July, 123 COVID cases were recorded, the highest number of new cases over 48 hours since the 22nd of May. Despite this, gyms, swimming pools and indoor sports courts were permitted to open the next day. The position in Scotland by the late summer of 2020 was that the Scottish Government had eased lockdown more slowly than the UK Government had decided to do. It has been suggested that the Scottish Government's strategy all along had been that no death from COVID-19 was acceptable, which meant, on one interpretation, that the first harm of the 4 harms strategy was to be prioritised over the others. This would at least be logically consistent with the slower easing of restrictions. The reasons for this strategy appear on the evidence we have. The reasons for this strategy appear on the evidence we have to be linked to the possibility that the Scottish Government had adopted a policy of zero COVID, an elimination strategy by this point. Some commentators opined that this was achievable, given the trajectory of the infection rate in Scotland at that time. For example, on the 28th of June 2020, following 2 days with no reported deaths in Scotland, Professor Devi Sridhar, an expert in public health at Edinburgh University, had predicted that Scotland could eradicate COVID-19 by the end of the summer. We will examine in this module whether this was, in fact, the policy of the Scottish Government, or if not, whether it should have been. This will involve consideration of whether such a policy would ever have been achievable in Scotland, given its land border with England and the 2 nations' considerable commercial and other links. In this context, we intend to look at the steps taken by Scottish Government over that period and the extent to which they did or could have achieved an elimination goal, including the complex issues born from the devolution settlement of travel restrictions and border controls during the summer. So August had seen a gradual reopening of society against the emergence of rising cases and local clusters of cases in Glasgow, Aberdeen and Tayside, amongst others. Local restrictions were used where it was thought to be appropriate. On the 2nd of September, Deputy First Minister John Swinney defended the Scottish Government's decision to allow pubs to remain open in Glasgow, following the introduction of stricter lockdown measures in the city, saying the virus was being spread by households rather than the hospitality sector. Cases, however, continue to rise, both generally and in the Glasgow area. By the 3rd of September, 101 new cases were confirmed, 53 of them in the Greater Glasgow areas. Scotland's border restrictions continue to be slightly differently applied from those imposed elsewhere in the UK. On the 7th of September, a further 146 Covid-19 cases were reported. Nicola Sturgeon said it may be necessary to put the brakes on the further easing of the lockdown in Scotland. With cases continuing to rise, on the 14th of September, Nicola Sturgeon indicated there were very serious concerns about COVID testing backlogs and that she was seeking urgent discussions with the UK Government about the issue. On the 22nd of December, it was announced that the ban on visiting other households, which had been in place in the west of Scotland, would be extended across Scotland from the following day, and that a 10 p.m. curfew on pubs and restaurants would follow from the 25th. You have heard evidence, my lady, in Module 2 of the advice given by SAGE to impose a further lockdown in the autumn of 2020 and the lockdown in November 2020 in England. Neither the proposed lockdown nor the actual lockdown which was imposed in England took place in Scotland. We will examine in this module what the reasons were for why no lockdown took place in Scotland over this period, against the background of rising cases which did occur, the extent to which the restrictions actually imposed were appropriate in the circumstances, as well as the advice upon which the decisions to impose them and not deeper restrictions were taken. With outbreaks at universities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, St Andrews and Aberdeen around the 24th of September, students at Scottish universities were advised not to visit pubs, restaurants or parties and to socialise only with members of their accommodation in a bid to stem the spread. This led to concerns that students were being singled out for the acceleration of the virus. Cases continued to rise steadily, but on the 1st of October 2020, the Scottish Government did not impose any additional rules. By the 5th of October, ministers met and discussed the possibility of a 2-week circuit breaker to stem the escalation of cases. No such lockdown was imposed. By the 7th of October, Scotland recorded more than 1,000 new COVID cases in a day. The Scottish Government announced that bars and restaurants in the Central Belt must close from 6 p.m. on the 9th of October, the closure remaining in place until the 25th. On the 14th of October, the Scottish Government warned people against travelling to Blackpool after the town was linked to a large and growing number of Scottish COVID-19 cases. On the 23rd of October, Nicola Sturgeon unveiled Scotland's new 5-level COVID-19 management system, which is due to come into effect from the 2nd of November. The purpose of this system was intended to allow the Scottish Government to respond more flexibly to localised outbreaks. We intend to explore in the module the rationale for this system, in particular in light of the fact that on the 12th of October, the Scottish Government had announced plans to draw up a 3-tier COVID restrictions system, similar to the one which had been announced for England. The level system was used over this period, with the Scottish Government controlling the levels into which each local authority would be put, and its position being that the use of this system was keeping the spread of infection relatively stable. However, on the 17th of November 2020, Level 4 restrictions were announced for 11 council areas in the west of Scotland due to rising cases, effective from 6 p.m. on the 20th of November until the 11th of December, and covering a population of 2.3 million people. These restrictions caused a degree of controversy, and expressions of frustration at a local level were at times regarding the levels imposed, which were at times not well received. The remit of our module will also include consideration of the extent to which Scottish local authorities were involved in key decisions being reached. Were they or their representatives adequately consulted? Were they given adequate information to permit reasonable participation in the process? Were their views given adequate consideration, in particular where the fight against the virus became more regionally based? What role did they have in the communication of local restrictions and the need for them to be communicated to the residents of their areas? In light of rising cases towards the end of 2020, attention started to turn to the question of what would happen around Christmas. On the 8th of December, the Scottish Government announced its first vaccinations against coronavirus had been given in Scotland to those who would be carrying out the vaccination programme. On the same day, it was announced that all 11 areas living under level 4 restrictions would be downgraded to level 3 from Friday the 11th. The announcement prompted anger from council leaders in Edinburgh and Midlothian that their areas remain in level 3, despite expectations they would move to level 2. This led to an ultimately unsuccessful challenge by Edinburgh City Council in court against that position. By the 19th of December, following the emergence of a new, faster-spreading variant, the Alpha variant, Nicola Sturgeon announced that a festive relaxation of restrictions would be limited to Christmas Day, with mainland Scotland placed under level 4 rules from Boxing Day. Travel between Scotland and the rest of the UK would not be legal. Restrictions were relaxed for Christmas Day to allow people to mix indoors and travel more freely, despite concerns which had been raised by business. On the 26th of December, mainland Scotland moved into level 4 restrictions, close to full lockdown. By the 29th of December, 1,895 new COVID cases were reported, the highest number in a single day. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon urged people to stay at home at Hogmanay and not mix with others, declaring it to be vitally important. On the 30th of December 2020, 2,045 COVID cases were recorded, the highest daily total since mass testing began. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon described the new variant of concern as fast becoming the dominant one. On Hogmanay 2020, Scotland reported 2,622 positive tests. Hogmanay events were cancelled and people were warned to stay at home. My lady, if it's convenient to you, that would be an appropriate point to break for lunch.
Certainly, Mr Dawson, thank you. I shall return at 1:45.